Great. All right. So this is the title and cover of the book. Basically, the question that's been around for God forever is, how do people change their behavior? And my take on it is pretty different from the standard take, which has forever been a question of what could you give an individual, like in terms of money, incentives, threats of punishment, that would get them to change their behavior. And my view is that when you're looking at an individual, what you're actually looking at is someone who's embedded in a larger population. And so, for example, we look at the school of fish, there's 10,000 fish here, and you watch them school. What you're actually seeing is 10,000 individuals coordinating. And no individual fish, if you were to do an fMRI scan of their brain and try to figure out individually what they were going to do, would allow you to predict what the 10,000 fish were going to do when you put them together, the complex behavioral patterns they exhibit, and in particular, how adaptive those patterns are collectively and evolutionarily. And then also ways in which you might disrupt those patterns, what kinds of things you could do to the salinity of the seawater, to the temperature that would alter the collective behavior of the population. In order to study that kind of thing, in order to understand it, ultimately predict it and control it, you need to study populations as a whole. And so that's been my approach to social science. Instead of studying people one at a time, it's been to study large scale populations and how people interact to try to make predictions about how populations will shift. And that's really my take on social norms. Is that a norm is not something that exists in a person's head. A norm is a phenomenon that emerges out of lots of people interacting together. So you couldn't ask someone ahead of time, what are your norms? Right? It's just a kind of misguided approach to trying to understand them. What you need to do is to study people in groups and see what norms emerge, and then start to think about how you could study at that level what an intervention would look like. And that's what the book is all about, is this new way of doing large-scale behavioral social science. So the way that we typically think about social influence spreading through networks these days is we have a map or a topology of a network, and you can see that there are people with different positions. The different positions most likely have some implications. So the way that we call this out, and this is pretty much for the last 50 years, is to say, okay, there are some people who are in the center of the network and they have more ties, right? And then there are people in the periphery of the network and they have fewer ties. So we refer to these as social hubs or social stars, or today we use the word influencers. But basically, the person in the center has a lot more reach out into the network. So this historically in sociology has been called a weak tie, because the person is just reaching out to basically strangers everywhere. They don't know them well, but they have a lot of these contacts. Whereas the people in the periphery, it's not just that they have fewer ties. This is important. There's two things going on. They have fewer ties, but those ties tend to be clustered together, right, into like overlapping networks that look kind of like a fishing net, right? Lots of little triangles. Whereas the person in the center has this like fireworks explosion network going out in all directions. So it's been the argument for a long time that if you want to initiate social change and kind of put it into the network, you have to find the right spot. So where should you start? And the argument has been, and this is what the kind of latter day version of the influencer is that you find the person with the most connections who's in the center of the network, and they're going to sort of launch an explosion for you that gets your innovation to take off. So it looks pretty much like this. You have an innovation, you start with someone who's highly connected, they spread to their friends and contacts, and very soon it just explodes in all directions and spreads out through the network and reaches the periphery or the outside at the very end, because those people are less connected. So this has been dogma in the social sciences, and honestly in pretty much every applied field, from computer science to soil biology, for about 75 years. Here's the thing. What we've been able to do in the last 10 years that we've never had before then is to look at the data and actually see what that spreading process looks like, who adopts from whom, what those network channels look like, and then to be able to make predictions and say, okay, if we're able to do several of these sort of interventions side by side in controlled settings, we could actually test which of these would be more effective. And what we see in the data is something interesting. This is from the 2011 growth of Arab Spring, and these are data from Twitter. Because large-scale Twitter network, what we see is that people are popping up and trying to do things all the time. I mean, there were calls for revolution in Egypt for like a decade, right? But just nothing was triggered. But then just prior to 2011, there was this group way out here in the periphery, and they were clustered together. They banded together, and they started this initial movement, the April 6th Party, and they pushed it. And as they pushed it, it didn't jump to the center. It actually pushed around the periphery through these what we typically thought of as slow spreading, overlapping networks. And then it kept spreading round and around and around. And what's so interesting about this is it never really reached the middle of the network, but yet it was becoming a substantial social movement. And then it was only toward the end of the movement that it finally reached the center of the network and subsumed a much larger frequency or fraction of the population. So this is the important take home just to start off, is that on the left-hand side, you've got a story of diffusion, which is the story that I was told in grad school, we were all told, which is the story on the left, which is that if you want change, you start in the middle and spread it outward. But we've got new science, and part of that is new data, but part of that is actually a much powerful new theory of being able to study at large scale with computational tools, uh, trials and attempts and trials and failures of trying to initiate change under different conditions. And we find that the strategy on the right, ironically, starting with like less connected people out in the periphery, is consistently more effective at generating diffusion. And this is exactly what all the data suggests. So what goes wrong? And this is really where the rubber meets the road, is if we're making this mistake, and some very smart scientists for 50 years have been making the same mistake, there's got to be a problem in our thinking. They're not making this mistake out of laziness or stupidity, right? They're making this mistake because they're just kind of looking at the world the wrong way. And what goes wrong is that when we look at these two networks, the one on the left just looks fast. It just jumps out at us because we see the person in the center and their ties, their weak ties spreading out in all directions. And our intuitions run to it and say, that looks like it's going to be a much better place to try to diffuse an innovation than the network on the right, where everyone's clustered together. So to get to spread from one part of the network to the other, it's going to have to go through person to person to person to person, this long chain of interactions to reach more people. This is true if we're talking about something like COVID-19. If you have COVID-19, then what you want is, if you're a malicious actor and you want to spread COVID-19, you think, well, I want a super spreader. I want someone who's going to be in the center of that star on the left, who's going to be really sick. They're going to have interactions with lots of people. They're going to get lots of people sick, and those people are going to be all over the place. So then they're going to get lots of people sick, and you get this kind of exponential growth of the illness. But the network on the right, it's like, well, the sickness is just going to bounce around in those little tiny networks. It's going to be very easy to contain. It's not going to spread very far, very fast. But now think when you're talking about vaccination. So now you've shifted from the spread of a disease or a virus to the spread of a real behavior, a behavior that people resist. Well, now that person in the center is talking to lots and lots of people who may or may not be interested in vaccination. And so just because someone in the center says it, those people in the middle are probably going to resist it because they don't want to do it. So just getting one signal from an influencer isn't enough. Whereas the people on the periphery on the right, usually they have a cluster of some friends and family who are starting to get vaccinated, and that creates a lot of social reinforcement. And that's going to be a key principle for us, thinking about the differences between viral spreading versus behavior spreading, and the way that these two kinds of networks actually wind up sort of working in opposite directions. So the network on the right, when it comes to behavior spread, actually becomes our optimal network for initiating a change process. And so what really goes wrong here is this difference between epidemiological thinking that everything spreads like a virus, which picks out the network on the left, and social thinking, which is that people take into account the social context. They're looking at who is talking to them. They make evaluations about that person and that person's lifestyle and how similar it is to their own lifestyle. They think about all these things when they're making an evaluation about what to do. So I'm going to talk briefly about the viral intuition and how and why it fails and why it's been around for so long and why it's really led us to make some really bad policy choices. When I say policy, I'm just talking more generally. Of course, we've made some bad public health policy choices, but even companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon have done really stupid things that have lost them hundreds of millions of dollars because they've been assuming that the viral model would work. You don't talk about or hear about that much because if they lose $100,000 or $100 million, it's just not that big a cost to them, honestly. In the grand scheme of things, they build stuff all the time that doesn't work. So it's fine. They chalk it up to a failed experiment or a failed attempt, and they go back to the drawing board. For people who work in the nonprofit sector, that's a lot of resources to throw at something that doesn't work. That would seem like a fiasco. So it's important to keep in mind that everyone faces these problems. They're just noticed at different scales. So the solution here, and this is what I want to really get into, is that what matters is the distinction between a simple contagion, like a virus, and a complex contagion, like a behavior. Once we understand that, we'll start to understand exactly how networks operate. And what this does, once we understand it, is it pulls from our eyes this myth that we've had about how networks operate and how they're supposed to work to initiate change. Um, and one of the things I'll talk about when I start talking about these myths that we've had and why they fail and also why we hold on to them still is that these myths are easy to tell. It's easy to look back over history and find a kind of a story that seems to fit with the viral story. And so even though that's not what happened, the data don't support it, we can kind of find anecdotes that make it sound true. And so we gravitate to the simple story even when we know it's not what happened. So once we start to kind of pull ourselves into a more clearly scientific way of understanding this process, we understand behavior change, and we also understand what it means for triggering large-scale tipping points. So I'm going to talk in the end about what that means between different strategies like using nudges, which are basically still treating like people like lone individuals, right? Like individual fish, versus norms, where you're trying to shift entire populations all at once. So this is a lot of stuff, but these will actually go fairly quickly. So I'm going to talk about contagiousness, simple and complex, then these three myths, the myth of virality, the myth of stickiness, the myth of the influencer, and then get to the meat of it, which is how do you build a contagion infrastructure and how do you trigger tipping points? So the best way to think about contagiousness is to remember the beginning of the pandemic back in 2019, beginning of 2020, when there was just a lot of misinformation. There was, I think, even in the beginning of my book, I have this bit about handing people paper at work. We thought it was transmitted by fomites. So there's all this confusion about when and how people get sick. And what we knew was that it was, if you talk to people a lot and you breathe near them and you're unprotected, that there's a high likelihood that virus is going to be transmitted. So the solution was to wear face masks at that point. And what we found was that the coronavirus spread across political boundaries and it spread across religious boundaries and national boundaries effortlessly, right? It didn't matter who you were, where you're from, or what you believed. You could catch the coronavirus from anyone. That's not true for face masks. For face masks, actually, seeing someone wearing a face mask raised all of these social issues that were completely distinct from anything the coronavirus had to face. All of a sudden, people were worried about who the person that was wearing a face mask was. If they were from a different group, maybe that was a good reason for them not to wear a face mask. And so a face mask became more of a political symbol. And you saw this like social reification of groups, Democrats and Republicans in the US. And so wearing a face mask became like a symbolic act. And as a result, people were not wearing them, not just because they were uncomfortable, but as like an explicit statement of disbelief in a whole set of political values. So that tells you that there is something fundamentally different going on between the epidemiological process of viral spreading and the social process of face mask adoption. So let's think about that in a minute. So simple contagions, viral contagions work like this. This is the model you've seen a million times. So a person shows up into a network, that person's activated, they interact with a peer, and that peer catches the infection. Typically, we think of measles, COVID-19, influenza, they all work this way. But also truly like gossip and viral videos work this way too. It's very easy for one person to spread something to somebody else. Then once that person adopts it, they spread it to everyone they know. And so very quickly, in just 2 steps, a new person into a community has now activated the entire community. What's the difference with complex contagions? With complex contagions, well, first let's say for simple contagions, what we're assuming is that contact equals transmission, there's no resistance, everything, whatever's spreading is easy, familiar, and low cost. With complex contagions, now imagine we're talking about back in like 2019, 2020, we're talking about face masks. So let's say all the people in gray are not wearing face masks, and the person in black shows up and she is wearing a face mask. And she tells the person in the middle. The person in the middle now is an interesting position because unlike COVID-19, she's not like debating whether or not to, adopt it. It just happens. It's transmitted. But with a face mask, she has to think about it, right? She has to think about the legitimacy of this behavior, whether it's credible with her people. So she looks around the rest of her network shown in gray, and none of them wearing face masks. So the one person wearing a face mask is doing something that's not perceived as legitimate to the rest of her community. So although that person adopts, it doesn't convince the person in the center. Now, a second person may adopt, which increases the social pressure. But still, the vast majority of her social community are not wearing face masks. So when they show up and everyone's standing outside in a street corner, and those 2 people are using face masks, the rest of her friends standing there, not wearing face masks, provide countervailing influences, pressures against, that stop her in the middle from adopting a face mask. And this is important because it only happens for complex contagions, where you're paying attention not just to the adopters, but you're also paying attention to the non-adopters. Then finally, let's say another person joins. Now she has half of her neighborhood, three of her friends, have worn face masks now. Now they're all together, and she notices that basically half of the people wearing face masks. And she feels like now this behavior has enough social legitimacy, enough credibility among her friends and colleagues that now she's willing to adopt. And this is the big difference, is that in order for a complex contagion to spread, it's not just that it requires multiple sources of contact, which it does, but it's also that resistance from the behavior isn't just someone's personal resistance, it's also resistance that comes from everyone else they know. So the broader network of people you're interacting with actually helps to frame how a behavior is received, whether you ultimately adopt it. And so this is true whenever something is difficult or costly and unfamiliar. This is, of course, true with any new kind of technology, right? Adopting a new social media platform or leaving an existing one, like leaving Twitter. Anytime a social movement is thought as risky or costly, this is also true. And so anytime legitimacy or credibility are at work, these kinds of complex dynamics are the sort of way of understanding how behavior change spreads through social networks. Now, this means, and this is the big implication, that our classic trifecta, like our ways of understanding success in diffusion, that things spread virally, that the best way to succeed is stickiness, and that the best people to target are influencers, all three of these assume that we're talking about viral contagions. And that's something that's not always obvious. You have to see that all these three derive from the epidemiological literature to see that we've then imported these into social science, and it's led us to make huge mistakes. So let's talk about the myth of virality. The way it's phrased is Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book that kind of summed up the kind of classical view, the incorrect view of how this stuff spreads. And he said, look, ideas, behaviors, new products spread like a virus. And he goes on, he says, like, this isn't a metaphor. I mean, literally, they spread just like viruses do. Okay, so we have lots of data from decades showing that that's not true. Back in Korea, 1960s, at that time, there were lots of nations that were going through demographic transition. They were moving from, rural agrarian societies where there was a high infant mortality. So, parents would have 5 to 6 children, expect about 2 of them to live. Where all of a sudden, these countries, Pakistan, India, South Korea, were just inundated with modern Western technology, with sanitation, with increased jobs, increased food supply, and so forth. What that did was it dramatically reduced infant mortality. So just from a simple population growth calculation, you know that in 2 generations, if everyone keeps having 5 to 6 children, there's going to be just a phenomenal population explosion to the point where we're looking at mass devastation and starvation. You can't support population growth at that level. So there were these mass campaigns to try to reduce fertility rates. And the result was that, some countries, Pakistan and others, used these shaming strategies of trying to convince people they were doing something morally wrong. But what they didn't take into account is they weren't really dealing with individuals, right? It wasn't telling a person to have fewer kids. It was the fact that this idea of having 5 to 6 children had been ingrained socially and culturally for generations. It was believed this is what made you a good member of society, a good parent, a good person, was having a large family. And so in one generation, trying to convince everyone that all of a sudden their job and their duty was to stop having children was very, very hard. It cut against everything they understood and their parents understood and their grandparents understood. So it was largely unsuccessful. And then you have Korea. And that's the sort of focus of our story, because Korea stands out because it did in 20 years, which is a remarkably short time for doing large scale social planning. In 20 years, Korea reached all of its policy goals in terms of changing fertility levels for the entire nation. And so the question is, well, what did Korea do that no one else did? And what Korea did was it adopted a social norms approach to changing it. Instead of changing it like telling each person they're doing something wrong, they told communities about other options and tried to get inside those communities and use the social networks in those communities to trigger a change in behavior. So these are the 3 different kinds of communities you saw in Korea. One is brokers, where these were tightly knit clusters. They have some ties to other villages, but not much. These were what are referred to as wide bridge communities. This is where our focus is going to be for a few minutes. It is communities where you've got village and village networks, and across them there's lots of overlapping wide bridges. This allows for reinforcement. And over here are the urban parts where you've got just ties in every direction. This urban setting is the best for disease diffusion because there's so many random people bumping into each other that a virus spreads very quickly. Interestingly, if you try to use this for disease diffusion, or sorry, for spreading contraception, winds up happening is nothing. It doesn't spread at all, actually. Um, and it's the reason is because you've got those 5 initiators, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, shown in red, who are trying to sort of start this contraception campaign, but they can't work with each other. They can't coordinate to grow any critical mass. Now, if you try to do the same thing with these small villages with brokers, where you think, well, I can sort of gain critical mass within this one group, and then it'll spread to other groups. Well, it works within a group because there's reinforcement, and you can grow that sort of complex contagion dynamic within the group. But then there's only a single tie across groups. So when it reaches across to the other group, it arrives with no reinforcement and can't spread. So it stays stuck there. Now, something very special happens, and these are the communities with wide bridges. This is what they found in Korea, is that if you find these communities that have lots of reinforcing ties within a cluster, and there's lots of overlapping ties that carry the sort of social influence and the idea of contraception, then these groups, which are largely women's groups, can talk to each other about what this innovation is, when they should use it, whether it's safe or not safe, whether it feels socially legitimate to use it, whether there's social currency. All those things simply get created by virtue of being embedded in the right kind of social network. And it spreads, as you see, it doesn't spread everywhere at once like a virus. It actually spreads in a very systematic fashion, overlapping from one group to the next group to the next group. And this gives us a kind of a very deep insight, looking at that case in Korea, to all of our modern organizations, all of our various farming groups, and all of our various sort of innovations in organizations trying to initiate change in consumer and in worker behavior, which is that when you have several different groups and they're disconnected, let's say A, B, and C, this is famously referred to as siloing. And it means that any innovation that people in A adopt, people in B never learn about. And so the logic here and the history, and I think you guys will be familiar with this, is look, you should have special people, they refer to them as brokers, and those people like Robert who form ties. And Robert forms a tie to Elizabeth in group A and to Emily in group C. And now it's Robert's job to tell everyone what's going on. He learns about the innovations that Elizabeth's group A have adopted, then tells everyone in group B, and then tells everyone in group C. And so Robert is like the linchpin for this sort of diffusion process. Now, there's parts of this that are true and parts of this that are importantly and devastatingly false. So this has been around for 20, 30 years, and got increasingly famous in the organization's literature, this idea of Robert as a broker across structural holes. So it's true that Robert's very good at spreading information. He finds out what Elizabeth's doing, and he can tell everyone in group B and everyone in group C about it. And because of this, and a lot of the literature talks about this, this is like networking 101, how to get famous and successful in your job. Robert gains a lot of status and power. He gets known as the person, the sort of playmaker who connects people together and finds out what's going on. And because of this, more people come to Robert. Robert drills more of these like weak ties. And Robert starts to look like one of these fireworks explosions. He has ties going out in all directions. He becomes more of a social star. And two things happen from that. One, Robert wins more rewards at his job and becomes more, promoted, gets more status and more money. But second, is that Robert seems like utterly vital to the organization, right? They can't lose Robert. So if they do, they lose all those network ties with him, and they're kind of back to where they started. So there's a kind of exclusivity that comes with Robert's role that it puts the organization in a bind, rather they're beholden to Robert. And again, that's really good for Robert. But to think now what's good for everybody else in the organization, right? So imagine we change the ties a little bit. Because if Robert learns about something, let's say an innovation from group A, where Elizabeth and her colleagues are advancing new norms of gender relations within the organization, their group has started to change the expectations for how women and men interact. Now, Robert can tell people in group B about that, but if they're not on board with those new gender norms, just hearing about it from Robert certainly isn't going to be enough for them to sort of want to change their whole work routine or adjust their expectations about how they treat women in the workplace. So it's fine for information to spread this way, but it's unlikely that any real changes in culture or social norms are going to spread across a single tie from Elizabeth to Robert. But now imagine the ties from A to B look like this. What we've done is we've made it the link between A and B, instead of it being a narrow bridge, now it's a wide bridge. So wide bridge consists of these multiple overlapping ties. So now what happens is if the people in group A have adopted these new changes in workplace culture and shifted gender norms in group A, now Multiple people in group B can observe people in group A, watch how they work together, watch how more efficient their work practices are, how more comfortable the women in those in group A feel, and how effectively how it's improved the quality and productivity of life at work. Now, what those people in group B can do that Robert can't do alone is they can talk to each other. They can actually think about what that means, what people in group A are doing, and how to integrate it into group B. And so those multiple reinforcing ties from A to B become an opportunity for people in group B to coordinate around this new idea with Robert and with their colleagues, and then start to introduce it into group B. And this is the real power of wide bridges, is it creates this sort of internal trust within group B around this something that's going on in group A they don't know much about. And then they can initiate it and spread it through group B. And then more wide bridges from B to C can then facilitate the spreading of the same sort of innovation from B to C. And this is a really big lesson because it teaches us that key changes in the width of the sort of bridges across parts of an organization or across different organizations can be essential for allowing changes in social norms and practices to spread across different parts of an organization or different parts of an industry. And so when you look at a structure like this that has wide bridges, the next question should be, where do these show up? And they show up everywhere. It turns out that some places have done this very strategically. They've thought through wide bridges and implemented them intentionally. The Human Genome Project did this with lots of independent labs, connecting them through wide bridges so they could share things that were historically, patented and prototyped and not to be shared. And they had to figure out a way of allowing scientists to learn from each other so they could replicate protocols effectively to do this like massive thing with 20 labs around the world who are all effectively competing for the Nobel Prize. But they had to somehow make them coordinate. IBM, Lucent, all of Silicon Valley has been very, very aggressive. They've been at the forefront of this in terms of designing an industry culture where industries often have these wide bridges where they share lots of, what was historically thought of as, protected information. They share it with each other in a way that allowed for rapid growth and rapid learning across these different organizational boundaries. There's different scientific fields like cognitive science, network science that happen, I'm appointed across 3 different parts of the university, as are many of my colleagues, right? So we have these wider bridges across intellectual spaces, and it actually accelerates our thinking on lots of topics. And Black Lives Matter is one of my favorite examples of this because this is a place where the structure emerged endogenously, emerged without anyone trying to build it. It just emerged by virtue of the need in this community where you would have these events happen all over the country. You'd have African American citizens being killed by police, and there'd be local protests, and then somewhere else would happen, and somewhere else would happen. And a lot of people talk about George Floyd's death in 2020 and talk about that as like a catalyst. But what they miss was that, in July of 2014, Eric Gardner was, strangled to death in New York by a police officer, and it was videotaped, and that videotape was posted online, which is that's really similar to what happened with George Floyd. And nothing happened. There was small protest. The term Black Lives Matter was tweeted like 48 times. There was no great uprising, even though all the same sort of technical and watchdog features were there. So what happened in Black Lives Matter? And it was actually the month after Eric Gardner's death. It was in Ferguson, Missouri. The Michael Brown was killed, and that's where this real protest started. And what happened there was so interesting is this is when the network started to shift. Is the networks of people, regular citizens in the streets tweeting with each other, noticed that mainstream media started saying things like, well, there are citizen mob, there are sort of mob protests in Ferguson, Missouri. And that's how the media was casting the reaction to the death of Michael Brown. And so it was just regular folks walking in the streets who were there looking at the body, who started tweeting back, not just to each other in their own kind of closed circles, but starting a conversation across these different groups with mainstream media through Twitter and through Facebook, responding and saying, why would you call it mob protests? We're citizens, or mob riots. Why would you call it citizens? We're citizens and we're protesting something that happened. And there was this dialogue that never before happened, this dialogue between like regular citizens and like really powerful media organizations going back and forth. And the more people who did this, the wider the bridge became, and the more this became a conversation. And within 2 weeks after Black Lives Matter started, after that hashtag started getting used a lot, and after the events in Ferguson, the vast majority of media had changed the way they were talking about it by virtue of their direct interactions with just citizens in the street, regular people. And all of a sudden, this network formed where people who weren't talking together at all, like there were Black activists, there were celebrities, there were white liberals, there were activist groups like Anonymous, there was the mainstream media, they were all in their own little bubbles. And these wider and wider channels of communication started forming where everyone started talking and thinking the same way about this phenomenon of the death of Black youth in the inner city by police violence. And it really just elevated the entire conversation where by November of that year, the White House got involved and started talking about this issue that had been around for 40, 50 years, but everyone was talking about it as something they had to handle immediately, largely because of these networks that form between these communities and the communication around these ideas. So the point is like networks and the structure of networks can seem like something ethereal and something that like just sort of doesn't really matter, although you can see how it might help in some organizational context. But it is crucial to growing a common understanding of a topic that can really shift everyone's thinking about it. And it changes our thinking of going from individual brokers to this idea of these groups that do this work of mediating between other groups. So when we finally internalize this idea of wide bridges, then the question is, what do we do? I mean, we're sometimes in a situation where we can, actually manipulate these bridges if we're like working at a firm or an organization where we're, establishing ties or we're managing multiple different soil projects, and we want to know how to connect those soil projects effectively so they can share information and synergize all the work they're doing individually. But there's this other question of like, well, how if we want to initiate a change? If we want to, the term is to seed it, like seeding a field. Where do we put our change agents? Like, how do we place them into the network? And the classic idea of viral seeding is you take these red change agents, and you put them as widely apart as possible. And then the intuition is the epidemiological intuition. It's like, well, you want as much exposure as possible for your ideas. So, everyone over here is going to learn about it from this person. Everyone here is going to learn about this person. So it's like trying to spread, COVID or measles. It's like you get so many more susceptible people for each sick person that this is really efficient. But again, I think you know what I'm going to say. I'm going to say that's true if you're talking about a disease. But if you're talking about something that requires social reinforcement, that requires ties to relevant people, then what's going to happen here when you put these people here, and this is the video playing now, is nothing. Because each of these people is surrounded by lots of people who have existing social norms and lots of countervailing influences pushing back on them. And so these individuals alone are going to be able to do nothing at all within each of these different communities because they're surrounded by countervailing social norms. So what happens if you take the same community, and this is what I think was incredibly powerful here, take the same community with the same structure and your same allotment of seed individuals. So in terms of the resources spent, the same resources. But instead of spreading them out everywhere, you cluster them together. Now, from a classic viral point of view, this seems insane. This is like having a bunch of telemarketers call each other. Like, why would you connect your seed agents to each other? There's no point. They already know what we're doing. We're trying to spread this innovation, this new farming technique. Well, the reason to do it is because you want them to support each other. They're going to get a lot of countervailing influences from the people around them. And when they do, you want them to be able to talk about that with each other and talk about what their strategies are and to learn from what kinds of countervailing pushback they're getting. And more importantly, you want these people to be connected to some of the same people so they can create some social reinforcement and relevance for this new idea. And what you see is so interesting is that, again, when this spreads, it doesn't jump everywhere like a virus. It spreads in a very systematic way. It spreads within group, it gains the cluster, and then that sort of critical mass spreads over to another group, gains the cluster, and then it spills over to another group. So what's doing work is the clustering inside each of these sort of coherent social groups. And then the wide bridges across groups is what carries it from group to group. And this is really how you see social change spreading when it spreads successfully. So a really good example of the viral seeding failure, like the example I just gave, is that it happens, we can talk about it in lots of spaces. We can talk about it in climate science and soil science, but it also happens in high-tech industry with lots of money. They make the same mistake. So I don't know if y'all remember Google Plus, but it was basically they tried to take over Facebook's market share. And their idea, which is not a dumb idea, but it takes the science to explain why it failed so badly. Their idea was to say, why can't we just take over everyone's social media by giving them Google Plus for free when they're already using some Google product? So if you're using Google's search engine, Google Plus shows up. If you're using Google's Gmail account, you automatically get a Google Plus account. If you're using YouTube at all, right, with hundreds of millions of people do, then you get a Google Plus account for free. So you're basically forced to have Google Plus, which is like this massive viral thing. We're just spreading it everywhere all the time. And so the idea is, at that point, you are so inundated with the fact that you have it and everyone you know has it and everyone they know has it, that we're going to take over the market, right? And it seems like classic viral reasoning. There's no reason it shouldn't work. Here's why it failed so colossally, and it did fail colossally. Within a few years, Google Plus not only disappeared, but they shut their doors entirely. That product does not exist anymore. Um, and of course, Facebook became more popular than ever. Right. So why did they fail? So Google is a smart company, right? So why did they fail so badly? What happened was people would look in their networks and they would first of all see that they had Google Plus, even though they didn't sign up for it, ask for it. And then they would know intuitively that everyone they knew had Google Plus because anyone who has any of these other technologies gets Google Plus the same way they did. So now everyone knows that everyone knows that everyone has Google Plus, and no one's using it, right? Everyone's still using Facebook. There was never that kind of critical mass push to shift social behavior. There was just mass availability, right? And so what winds up happening is people started to form these like beliefs, these like self-justificatory beliefs about why Google Plus was a bad technology. And they were total fictions. They would just invent them because people needed a reason to explain to themselves why they weren't using this thing they were be giving for free. So they started coming up with these explanations about, why it was a bad technology. And everyone started talking about that. And that became this kind of implicit social proof against Google's own technology that was a result of Google's viral strategy. And as a result of that, it reinforced the value, the positive value of Facebook. And in the end, Google Plus collapses. Now that happened with Google, and what's an interesting sidebar here is that this exact same thing happened nearly 100 years earlier with hybrid corn. And that's like, I think, a really good example for thinking about, farming and soil science, because hybrid corn was this type of corn that was invented specifically to address the drought conditions during the 1930s. And the problem that the corn had been inbred, it was hard to harvest. And they had a mass marketing effort. They brought all the companies out to the Midwest, to Iowa in particular, and they had like 70% market saturation in terms of awareness that hybrid corn was there and it was going to solve all their problems. And that's that's huge, particularly back then. That required like a ton of work, door-to-door effort to get everyone to know about this product. And what wound up happening is that neighbors looked at each other and they were all really reluctant, partly because the Dust Bowl and the drought, partly because of like coming out of a Great Depression. Everyone was a little bit nervous about trying something new. And when they saw their neighbors not adopting the hybrid corn, they started to come up with little stories. They started to invent fantasies about why those neighbors wouldn't adopt hybrid corn. And then people talked about those things. The viral part was actually a negative viral part. It was the viral part of the gossip and the rumors about something untrue about hybrid corn. And that wound up spreading so fast that at the end of 3 years of like intense marketing campaign throughout the Midwest, you had 70% market saturation and 1% adoption, which is like textbook fiasco. And so the marketers packed up and left. And then something very special happened. When all that pressure went away, when all that marketing went away, then a couple of farmers, that 1%, formed what the people studying at the time referred to as a quote unquote community laboratory. And it was just a couple of farms who were kind of trying it out with part of their crop, and they saw how it worked. And a couple of their neighbors came over and said, hey, how did that work? What did you think about it? How was the corn itself? I mean, did it make effective feed? And there was this sort of social experience happening around the farms that had tried it out. And it began to grow, and it began to grow. And within a few years, hybrid corn, all by itself, without any marketing pressure, hybrid corn actually took over all of Iowa. And then within 10 years, it took over the entire country. 100% of farmers were using hybrid corn. And what's so interesting is that all the sort of standard viral and marketing strategies had caused complete failure. And this social network process that no one was really trying to make work happened all by itself through these sort of overlapping wide bridges between communities. And it really gives us a new way of thinking about what it is that's going to make for successful spreading. And so this is actually useful, and I'll try to wrap this up quickly now, but this is really useful when we think about the lessons we get from Korea about when do we get successful spreading. Because I think one of the lessons also, especially when we're in the conversation about certain practices or certain products, is that you know, there's one right practice, there's one right product, and if we just get the right one, it'll spread, like it's sticky enough. One of the interesting things they found in Korea, where you would think there'd be like one right model of contraceptive that works best for that culture and that culture's history, it turns out that each of the villages adopted social norms so that they all coordinated on contraception, but the method of contraception varied from village to village. So within a given village, everyone was IUD, and within a different village, everyone was the pill. In a different village, everyone was condom. And so what you saw happening is that the norm spread. The norm was attached to a certain method. And so a women's group would adopt a certain method and sort of talk to other women. You got this kind of social influence process that allowed that kind of that behavior to take hold. But the key thing here wasn't the technology itself. The key thing was the social norm of acceptance of using a birth control technology. And that really frames for us the sort of the myth of stickiness that we've been taught for a lot of years, that, if a product has certain properties, then that product will spread. And nothing has been more conspicuous in its failure than in attempts to curtail HIV prevention, curtail HIV spread in sub-Saharan Africa. They tried these things like male circumcision. That didn't go over very well at all because they were like cultural profanities. And then they said, we need a magic pill, a magic product. And they invented pre-exposure prophylaxis. It's basically the same medication you get for HIV. And so they said, okay, we'll make this very much like the Google Plus story. We'll make it so accessible, so available that everyone will just take it. So it's free. It's basically one Tylenol a day. It's every place you can go, you can get it. And you just, you asked for it. And so they signed up all these women from all these countries, from Zimbabwe and from Uganda and South Africa, to participate in the study. So it's this massive 3-country study in sub-Saharan Africa. And what they found, and this is the most interesting part, is that the women who were part of the study, so these women were going every week to get blood tested to make sure they didn't have HIV, to see how effective this pill was. And what the doctors found, and it was such a baffling thing, they actually wrote an article in the New England Journal of Medicine announcing their failure, because the failure was so unexpected, was that it wasn't just that people, had HIV. It was that fewer than 30% of the women who were in the study going every week to get their blood tested actually had the pill in their bloodstream. In other words, people were collecting it, they were doing what they were supposed to do, but they weren't actually taking it, right? Which is baffling. And what was going on is that there was this fear in the community, and this is where social norms really kick in, that the disease would be caused by taking the pill. And this is something actually you see in the US a lot too. People think like getting the flu shot will give you the flu, or getting the COVID shot will give you COVID. Right? People have this kind of fear. And that was showing up in this case as well. But it was compounded by the fact that there were strong social norms of discrimination against HIV. So you get this really weird irony where people thought that taking the medication that would prevent HIV somehow increase your risk of suffering discrimination about having HIV. And so the social norms in the community actually prevented people from taking the medication itself. And so this is the point. There's no clever solution to this from a medication design point of view. There's no right way of designing a medication that gets around this. You really have to get inside the networks of the social norms and shift those norms to make taking the medication acceptable. Let's see here. A few more minutes, and I'll just talk about the myth of the influencer, and then I'll stop. The myth of the influencer is very similar to what I showed you at the beginning. You've got basically this picture of the social network. You've got this picture of two sort of different parts of the social network, and this idea that, look, a person on the left who's in that kind of highly connected center of the network, that person has their sort of antenna out in all directions, the fireworks explosion. So if one person has an idea, anywhere in the network, the person in the center will know about it very quickly. So they learn very quickly. Then they sort of adopt that idea, and then they can spread it to everybody else, right? And this is how we think about the power of being highly connected, the power of an influencer. They have new ideas earlier than anyone else. They can spread them faster than anyone else. Again, who doesn't want that? But this is where we shift from thinking about simple contagions to complex contagions. When you're someone who has that many social ties, you don't have that many social ties by accident, right? You have social ties because you are incredibly attentive to the people in your network. People who are influencers, people who are stars, are very good at curating their social network and maintaining this sense of like, I'm on the same page with you with thousands of people, which is hard to do. They're very good at kind of managing all those ties. So if someone in the periphery has an idea that's, trivial or easy, drink this coconut water, whatever it is, it's fine for the person to adopt that and spread it. It's a simple contagion. But if someone in the periphery says, I think we should all get vaccinated, when everyone in the group has like agreed that we're kind of an anti-vaxxer group, that can't just go to the center person very quickly and spread. Because if the center person takes on that idea, they're aware that they've got all those ties around them, not as outgoing ties, but as incoming ties. These are all people who are perceiving them and commenting on them and watching them and developing expectations for them. And so being an influencer means you're actually highly constrained in what you can do. There are real social pressures not to do certain things. And in particular, there are real social pressures not to adopt things that go against the standard social norms in your group. And so this means influencers are much less effective and capable of initiating change where change is really a shift in the social norms. Now compare this with the sort of fishing net network on the right, where someone in that network needs only a couple of people around them who reinforce an idea to create a local critical mass. That critical mass can begin to spread and spread and grow and grow. And that's what we see when we see these sort of change processes take off. They grow through these sort of clustered peripheral networks and gain such a large critical mass that ultimately they take over the whole population. Um, and what's interesting here is we have a lot of data from the last 10 years. The last 10 years has been fantastic for showing us how this works. The adoption of social mobilization, this is like support for marriage equality, support for innovation, diffusion, support for the growth of Arab Spring. We've seen this all on social media, but also we've seen, this is another kind of data we can trace, the adoption of social media technologies themselves. Like how did Twitter spread? How did Facebook spread? And it's all the same sort of growth dynamic where it spread like locally, friends of friends, even like geographically through San Francisco, friends of friends of friends of friends of friends. And then you get this cluster, and then it starts to jump down to other sort of friend groups through these wide bridges. So it's a really consistent and scientifically satisfying story of how we understand change processes, both for people offline adopting and then people online adopting. And what's interesting is that first quote, Becker 1970, is that if you go back before all the work on weak ties and before the work on hubs, this all happened in the 70s. If you go back to like the early 1970s, late 1960s, people were already identifying this problem. They were saying, look, the easy stuff tends to spread from these like social stars, but the hard stuff, the difficult challenges, it doesn't spread from them. It tends to spread from the periphery. And that's, what this more systematic theory explains and also gives us useful predictions for. I want to take him. I know I can talk for a minute about different strategies to target networks, but I want to take a minute here to see where we are with time. Tori, do you have any input?
Yeah, you're good on time. This is really good information, and I wanna dive deep into it.
Okay.
So long as you're okay with still taking a little bit of questions afterwards,
Yeah,
how
I
about
am. No, I am absolutely. Okay, so let me just go through this quickly because I think this is the in a way the fun part. And so you've kind of internalized a lot of new big ideas, and then there's a punchline here. There's ways you can use it. So if we look at a complex network like this, I think one of the questions that comes up based on everything I've said is to say, yes, Damon, I really understand that people in the center of the network are hard to motivate, hard to activate because they're surrounded by these countervailing influences. But what if I've got just a huge amount of money, right? What if I've got just a really great incentive and I can give it to this one person? Wouldn't that be enough? What if, this question, what if we could activate a social star? Well, this is what it would look like. Here's the social star, you activate the social star, and it looks like this. It just explodes everywhere in all directions, right? And you say, yes, exactly. That was my vision for viral spreading. And I want to say, yeah, that works really well if you're spreading like a viral video, or you're spreading, a disease, or you're spreading simple information. That is the classic model. Now, the problem is that a lot of people at this point stop and they say, okay, I hear you about complex contagions. I hear there's these challenges, but we already kind of understand the viral approach and we've got some money committed to it. So why don't we just do both? We'll do the viral approach. Maybe we'll get lucky. Maybe we'll get this kind of spreading. But if it fails, it fails. Then we can kind of go back to the drawing board and develop a complex contagion approach. So unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, if you adopt the viral approach, it can really undermine and ultimately prevent any future success with your diffusion effort. So it's not just a kitchen sink where you have the simple approach, the complex approach, throw them in, see what works. The simple approach fails and ultimately undermines the complex contagion approach. I'll show you the example of this. This is exactly what, and I don't mean to pick on Google because I like Google. They're an interesting company, but they're also standout because they are clearly a smart company and they've made these huge mistakes that have cost them hundreds of millions of dollars. Now they can afford to spend that, but still, these are embarrassments. I mean, Google Glass in particular was egg on the face for the owners. I mean, this is a big deal. Um, we designed Google Glass based on this simple contagion model where they were like, look, we're going to design, we're going to use the principle of stickiness. It's going to be exciting and memorable. People are going to talk about it. I mean, Google Glass, for those who don't remember, was like a cyborg technology. It was glasses you wear that could like surveil the environment, like record audio and visual in front of you. And it was elite. It was like a $1,500 pair of sunglasses. So it showed your kind of socio-technical sophistication. It was cutting edge stuff. And in addition to that, so the way they motivated the elite product was by hiring, specifically targeting influencers, people in the San Francisco Bay Area community who were thought of as like technically sophisticated, culturally avant-garde, to be their initial adopters. So they had stickiness, they had the influencer, and then they had the sort of mass virality where they just did this huge campaign letting everyone know that Glass was coming. So everyone knew Glass was coming, they knew the influencers had it, and they knew that it was like, talked about. So that should be it, right? That is the viral, playbook. Um, so what wound up happening in actuality was, this is the thing Google didn't anticipate, because as a tech company, it didn't really care or think about social norms. And this is where social norms is not vague or abstract or sciencey. It actually is where the rubber meets the road. Because what wound up happening was this technology violated like implicit social norms that weren't written down anywhere, but everyone had, which is that when you're in a cafe talking to people, and you're browsing the web at the same time, people perceive that as incredibly rude, right? It's really, people have a visceral reaction to that. They feel, they're offended. In addition to which, privacy, because people could sit in the park or watch people playing with their kids and record it, right? And it wasn't obvious they were recording it because they were recording it with their eyeglasses. And this was huge. People felt a tremendous violation of just like, being a good citizen, that it didn't seem appropriate that you should be allowed to record the visual environment and your glasses. And it also felt, and this is where rubber really, really met the road, it felt like a sign of privilege. Like if you were wealthy enough to afford $1,500 sunglasses, well, then you could record other people in the field, and they wouldn't know it. But if you couldn't afford it, well, then you were sitting there, you were just like fodder for people to record your activity, but you were left outside the loop. And so instead of creating aspiration, which is what the influencer model is meant to do, the influencer is interesting and cool and rich. So I want the thing they have, right? I want the glasses they have. It was the opposite. It created like a distinct form of backlash where everyone looked at the influencer and said, those people are terrible. What they're doing is terrible. Their flaunting of their wealth is terrible. And their use of their wealth to exploit and surveil regular people is abhorrent. And so there was this really dramatic kind of culture war that emerged directly around Google's product, where the term glasshole was invented by a journalist who had been attending these events and wore glass for a year. And by the end, he was like so embarrassed that instead of being considered like one of the people who was in the right and sort of the cultural norm, he was considered on the outside, one of the people who was trying to dominate the regular culture by being that sort of elite glass wearing person. So the backfire was so large. I mean, I've obviously lost Google a lot of money, but it was bigger than that. I mean, the entire product line was shut down, just shut down. And there's still these occasional news articles like, should we relaunch Glass? Should we do this? But here's the thing. Here's where stickiness backfires, right? The product was sticky. It was highly talked about. Everyone knew about it. So it's still highly talked about and everyone knows about it. Everyone remembers it pretty strong. You just have a very negative memory of it. And that's the downside of stickiness, is that you can control the fact that it'll be memorable, but you can't control what people will remember. And that was the sort of the misalignment between the capability of the product and the social norms that the product ran into. And I think most strikingly is that Google's reputation prior to Google Glass had been that it was a cool company. It's a fun company. It was a company that used its website for no reason. It didn't have to do this. Use its website to celebrate women and artists and scientists, right? Um, and there were all kinds of sort of culturally and socially relevant um, memes that were put up on the Google site on special days to kind of educate the population about things like um, women's activity and people from um, sub-Saharan countries and people from developing countries and minorities in the US, like really kind of amplifying the things that we think of as hidden and using this big platform to do it. So everyone sort of felt good about Google. In the wake of Google Glass, Google totally changed. Everyone perceived Google as like a tech juggernaut that used its power and influence to try to surveil society and give power to the rich. It really made Google look ugly. And to me, that's the hallmark of a fiasco, is where it's not just that they lost money, it's that it was a colossal backfire, and you can't recover a company's reputation after something like that. And so this is kind of the moment where we say, using a simple contagion strategy in the context of complex contagion isn't just failure, it's backfire. And that's why we have to be really careful. So then the question is, what do you do? And this is where it's so counterintuitive that it kind of requires this entire talk to really get it. If I showed you this at the beginning, there's no way it would have made sense. So here's the same network with the same population. They're resisting this innovation. You start with the influencer. Now we're spreading a norm, a complex contagion. The influencer, that's it, has like one or two people catch on around them because they know that person well. But then the problem is that not only are these people surrounded by countervailing influences, the people they know are surrounded by countervailing influences, as are the people they know, right? So it just doesn't get any penetration into the network when the influencer tries to spread a complex contagion. Now, the most interesting thing here is you grab a couple of people who are out here in the periphery, in this little cluster, who have no social status, no particular notability, except the particular cluster they're in is what I call complex centrality. In other words, this cluster is located at the intersection of lots of wide bridges. So if this cluster takes hold, then it can spread this innovation across wide bridges to other clusters, and they can take hold. So it seems like a much slower way of getting started, but it's a much more effective way of getting started in terms of overall growth. Now watch this spreading process. First, local reinforcement within the cluster grows sort of adoption, and then it starts to spread very slowly to nearby clusters. Interestingly, notice it doesn't go to the center. It doesn't actually jump to the center of the network. It cascades around the periphery till it reaches a critical mass. Once it reaches a critical mass, then it actually speeds up and moves across the center of the network, and that's when the diffusion process ends. And so interestingly, starting with the influence at the center generates no uptake, and starting with this little tiny cluster out here gets the entire network on board. This is what's so counterintuitive about complex contagion, right? It's the exact opposite intuition as the one you have going in, yet it's incredibly effective at initiating change. And there's more to say here about tipping points and how they work, but I think given the time for questions, I'll just end here. But the key strategic approach is the key punchline here is really it's about reinforcement. People need, if you see it only once and everyone else around you is not doing it, you have to take into account that everyone else around you, even if they don't say anything, just standing there without a face mask is enough to indicate that you're not wearing a face mask. So everyone around you is putting these sort of invisible pressures on you. So someone showing up initiating change isn't going to be effective. What you need is reinforcement from the other peers to create kind of a sense of legitimacy for this new behavior. And wide bridges are what allow legitimacy to spread from one group to another group. Second is relevance, is who are these people? Am I a Democrat? Are they Republicans, right? How am I evaluating their behavior against my behavior? And one of the key things I talk about this a lot in the book, how to establish relevance. What are the features of an environment that create relevance? So I'm paying attention to these people. And finally, the big shift here is that we're not looking at behavior change one individual at a time. We're looking at norm change, because behaviors just are norms. They're just behaviors in some sort of normative context. Right? A behavior doesn't make sense outside of social norms. So if you really want to shift a person's behavior, think about the norms they're in, and then think about the sort of shift in behavior that's needed. And Google Glass is a great example of this. Buying glasses seems like a behavior, but it's actually embedded in the space of social norms. You need to see those norms first before understanding how to shift behavior. And I think with that, I'll just skip these. and go to the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm gonna pull down your PowerPoint just so that people can see our big faces. And any questions for Damon? Just plug it into the chat. I'm gonna get us started off. In
Sorry,
just kind of,
would you mind moderating the chat? Because I'm going to be answering questions. I don't think
yes,
I'll have time to
yeah,
read it. Yeah,
yeah,
okay.
I'm on it. Yeah, I think I'm gonna start with oh, maybe a big sticky question for certainly our sector being like, you know, people in agriculture trying to influence ag to take on soil health best management practices. You saw in the Black Lives Matter movement that the technical components weren't weren't really a predictor of citizen uptake, but rather those wide bridges and the diversity within those bridges that determines the outcome. You saw with Google Plus that their method of seeding their technology reinforced the proof against their own technology instead. In our sector, we often survey farmers and ask, what's your barrier to adoption? And they say money. So we give them money and nothing changes. Or they say economic validation. And well, that's hard to do effectively given the diversity of realities among farming operations. But when we talk economics, that also doesn't really work. How much how much are we spreading the idea that these practices are not a financially feasible idea by doing that? But also, how do we tap into like, yeah, how do we tap into what those social norms are without outright asking, what are your social norms?
Right. No, it's actually a tricky topic, and I appreciate that you're bringing it up because it's one of those moments. I focus on the chapter in the book that deals with this most specifically is chapter 10, where I talk about the introspection illusion. Um, and the introspection illusion is just that when people are asked why they do things, they invent, and this is kind of like the hybrid corn is talked about in that chapter. They invent reasons why. Um, and those invented reasons are not scientifically validated is too strong a word. They're not scientifically found ever, which is to say, every single scientific test of like people changing their behavior has never ever confirmed in any case that the stories people tell about themselves actually are the motivations for their behavior change, right? And so this makes focus groups very dangerous, and it makes the challenge that you're facing hard because once you start to appreciate there's this disconnect between my story about who I am and who I believe myself to be and the actual norms that are governing my behavior, that there's a huge disconnect between those two. You say, well, I appreciate you have a story. I respect you as a person. I have a story too. But I'm interested in like shifting your behavior. So from that point of view, your story about yourself is for a moment less interesting to me than the norms that are actually governing your behavior that you're largely invisible, right? That they're largely unaware of. There are lots and lots of anecdotes from that chapter. It's a long chapter. There's lots of stories about like farming in Malawi and farming in the US. There's like all these different cases where it was largely farmers adopting different technologies. And like you asked them what they wanted, you asked them what they thought, and it was completely the opposite of what actually got them to change. Also, in the US, it was residents in California and sustainable energy practices. And the kinds of things the residents said was, I'm responsive to economic incentives. Tell me I'll save money. I'm responsive to like moral incentives. You tell me that like it actually will make the world a better place. I'll, save the place for my children, and so forth. Then I do that. So they broke up these families. They did this beautiful thing. It's one of the nicest experiments because it's kind of mundane in the sense they just did it in a very like, chock-a-block fashion. You do this, you do this, you do this. But it's nice because it's so systematic. It's like you can really see what happens. Where they interviewed all the families, found out what they thought would be effective for changing their household energy consumption, and then they broke the families into 4 groups. They said, okay, well, 1/4 gets money incentives. Here you go. Here's the money that's going to, you're going to save over the end of the month if you do this, right? 1/4 gets pamphlets on, social benefits. or and then another pamphlet gets pamphlets on like environmental benefits and reinforcement, and like these are the ways you'll be saving the environment. And the fourth one gets none of that. All they get is, hey, this is what your neighbors did, the social, which uniformly every single group said the social is irrelevant. I don't really care what my neighbors are doing. I care what I'm going to get personally. And the beauty is that they came back a month later, and instead of asking people what they did with their household energy consumption, they had just recorded the energy meter outside the house at the beginning, and they came back and recorded the energy meter again. So they needed an objective measure of household consumption or people in the same area. So like, you know, external factors were the same, right, in terms of weather and so forth. And what you saw was that the first three houses, the money, the social incentives, and the economic incentives, the kind of environmental incentives, moral incentives, those houses had no change in their energy consumption. But the houses who, although those people said it would be money or environment that would get me to change, they used a normative intervention regardless. And those houses were the only houses that showed a substantial drop in energy consumption, right? So regardless of what you say, there are things that work, right? There's machinery there that shifts your behavior. That's both promising and scary, right? It's scary because you can do things that people don't really understand themselves and nevertheless change what they do, right? It's promising because it means we understand the science a little better than the average person, right? We actually do understand what shifts it, and we understand the science well enough. We can run experiments with real homeowners and show how their behavior shifts. And it's the same with household. I write a lot about household solar panels in that chapter because that's when more people have been like hemming and hawing and pulling their hair out for decades, right? And again, people, they do a lot of access. A lot of it's market driven. So they ask people, what do you want? What do you think would work for you? And everyone says, I want this, I want that, I want. The only thing across Germany, Japan, the US, China, the only consistent explanation for people adopting household solar panels is that their neighbors adopted household solar panels. That's it. That's all we have after decades of research, regardless of what people say, right? It's so clear that the reinforcement dynamics of complex contagion are the only thing that work for getting this kind of thing off the ground. So I would say for you, the challenge is to be a social scientist when it comes to this stuff, is to really look at who are these people, where are they living, what are the factors? And this is where the research is helpful. It's saying, okay, let's look at people who've made similar decisions. Look at what the science tells us and believe that the introspection illusion is real, that like people will tell themselves a story that makes them feel consistent, right? Pretty much no one, and I'm going to put myself in this category, pretty much no one's going to say, well, why I do things? No, I'm just following norms. Like, am I really going to say that about myself? Probably not, right? As much as I study this stuff, as much as I know it scientifically, I'm probably not going to describe myself that way, right? So I couldn't design a good intervention for myself because I would put all this stuff in it that was unnecessary, right? But, scientists working with me would probably know what to give me so that, like, lo and behold, a month later, I'm acting differently. And what's interesting about this, I think most important, is we're not talking about just changing my behavior. We're not just talking about like my household solar panels. We're talking about like everyone in Southern Vermont, right? We're talking about shifting a community and the way that the community sees itself. And that's the and I think for a lot of people that seems like a bigger lift, right? And that's why nudges are often very attractive. We say, oh, if I can just nudge people one at a time, I can just keep applying that nudge, and then I'll get I nudge 10,000 people, I get 10,000 changes, right? It's like nudges work when people are not paying attention to other people. They work when you're filling out a form, right? And that's all you're doing is filling out a form, unaware of anyone else filling out that form. Then yes, a nudge can work. But if, like, let's say we're voting on a referendum, which is also on a form, and we've just had a big debate about it, so I know what everyone else thinks, my ideas have been shaped for, then the order of the candidates in the form isn't as much of an issue as the quality of all those social interactions shaping my belief about those elements in the form, right? So when you shift into a social space, nudges fall apart there. And in some cases, nudges can backfire, actually. If you give people lots of emails to say, remind, hey, go to the doctor, go to the doctor, go to the doctor. If I'm getting them, sure, maybe that repetition works. Repetition works. But if I see other friends and colleagues getting those emails and not responding, that effect doesn't just disappear, it backfires, right? I start to think, oh, these are just repetitive emails and no one else cares about them. No one else is going to the doctor. So people in that instance not only stop responding to emails, they unsubscribe to the service that sends the emails, right? And then their participation rate at the doctor drops off. So the thing to think about is like when we're interested in behavior change, are we interested in an individual or are we interested in shifting a population? And that really changes our strategies for thinking about how to get at the population level. Yeah.
Thank you. And I have a question about kind of targeting different structures. Have you seen any instances of like paired targeting? So targeting, peripheral actors and those like fireworks or like central influencer actors as like a combo approach.
Well, as I said, that's tricky because the influencer effect can really backfire in some cases, right? Um, because the thing to take into account is that when norms are in place, we don't really kind of know about them till we start to poke them, right? We don't really see our norms until things get awkward, right? They did these experiments in the 60s and 70s. This is one of like the ways sociology really got known. Um, is sociologists would do like super weird things. Everyone's like, oh, sociology is interesting. It's like interesting, yeah, it's also uncomfortable. But like they're called them breaching experiments, where like, okay, these are horrible, these are horrible. But like they had young Columbia grad students who were like, young healthy men walk up to women who are sitting on the bus. And sometimes like older women, sometimes pregnant women, and stand there and ask for their seat, right? And like everyone felt really uncomfortable about it. It's like, but there's no law, right? There's no, so what, so why not ask for the seat? And I was like, isn't it obvious, right? But that's their point, is like the obviousness of how we live every day, the things we do. We don't really start to see that till we start to push against it and things get uncomfortable, right? Here's the thing, behavior change can be uncomfortable, right? So you can put an influencer there who can start to push, but if you start to hit norms, what you experience is a breaching experiment type phenomenon where like people start to get uncomfortable and then they push back. And the danger there always is salting the earth. Right? The danger there is creating a feeling of like this thing isn't good. And then people have to explain it to themselves because their explanation is never going to be, I've got norms that make me feel uncomfortable. It's never going to be how people interpret themselves, right? Maybe in our private moments when we're reflecting and meditating, we can find that. But like in general, in life, in situations, we're just going to say there's something wrong with that person, and also that you can list all the things that frustrated you at the dinner table with your partner. Like that was just so rude. I couldn't believe it. Who would try to do that? So like that in the future makes you more resistant to that kind of thing, right? Because you think like, look, people who do that are insensitive or they're whatever. And that's why I think the combination approach is risky because it opens the door to like running headfirst into norms, right? Whereas the peripheral approach grows a kind of acceptance very slowly, kind of gently, and it looks less satisfying at first. That's why those simulations are so helpful, right? Because it looks less satisfying at first. You're like, this little group out in the periphery, why would I do things that way? It seems like a waste of money. Why wouldn't I just go for the gold? It's like because we're not spreading something simple. As soon as we shift to something complex, the strategy has to change. So I, in general, would not advocate for like both at the same time, um,
Mm-hmm.
because there's always the risk of like shooting yourself in the foot while you're starting to get going. It's like just be patient, just get it going, get it shifted. And once the norms start to shift, once people start to then sure, then you can use the influencer because then the thing you're talking about is simple at that point, right? You've shifted people's thinking, but the shifting people's thinking is the hard part. That's the thing to focus on.
Certainly. And yeah, in our own like Ontario agricultural social network, we've seen that happen, like anecdotally. We've seen the individual that has like fought tooth and nail to be an influencer and put themselves in the position of an influencer and met with countervailing influences, reacted really poorly,
Yeah.
and kind of worked against their own objectives of influencing adoption. but I do see a tendency to spotlight adopters by asking them to speak at conferences and like putting them in the spotlight. Like, and I think the reason that I see that is, for the same reason that I get asked all the time, how will we scale the soil network when we're using this like very gradual kind of snowballing approach?
Yeah.
And so, yeah. And so, uh, knowing that scale scale is more an issue of like how you're perceiving effectiveness and like how you're analyzing a spread, more than it is about like how many heads you get into a single room at a single point in time. How do you, yeah, how maybe talk us through the time scale and the impact scale of those like slow, gradual snowball approaches in
Yeah,
comparison
I think
to.
no, I think that thank you. I think scaling is the right concept. That's in fact the way that I've started in the last year. As you know, as the books come out, and I've done more of these sorts of conversations and some of this sort of consulting work in the conservation space. All of this has been focused on scaling. That's been like the default question is like, what do we do? For exactly the reason you're saying is because we associate scale with time scale, and they're different things. So we want to grow fast. And aside from all of the organizational management literature saying growing fast is dangerous and scary, you should be careful about it. That's actually unrelated to what I would say. So what I want to say is um, the proper way to scale is wide bridges. Wide bridges are the essence of successful scaling because what you're looking at with wide bridges isn't information flow. It's not a new idea coming across and people interpreting it however they want and kind of co-opting it for whatever sort of services or needs they have locally. That's what happens across narrow bridges, right? That's what brokers do. Wide bridges allow people to internalize that there's a norm and a set of practices and think about what that means for them collectively as they grow and kind of shift their culture, right? And so scaling really is large scale culture shift. And so you have to think about that when you're asking people to change their practices, you're asking them to risk being inefficient for a while, right? You're asking them to take a lot of uncertainty on board in terms of how good they're going to be at their job, how good they're going to look to their bosses, how good their whole team's going to look. And so these are the kinds of things that make it scary. And so trust is actually a huge part of scaling. That's within an organization or within an industry or within a field. And that's true for everyone. We all have those concerns. And so sometimes the things we are supposed to learn look hard and looks like, hey, we're pretty good at what we do. And a group in marketing may be familiar with something, and the group in engineering may be familiar with something. And engineers come up with this great innovation. And privately, people in marketing may be thinking that may be great, but it's going to take us like 8 months to learn it because we're not engineers. And like our productivity goes down for 8 months, and then we get fired, someone else gets hired, right? So like, that's great for them, but it does not great for us. And so the question is, well, how do we then, if let's say the innovation is great though, how do we then integrate it into a way of doing things that's quite different from the source group, right? So a group over in fisheries comes up with a really good idea for integrating their, there's sort of green and gray, right? But like their green style of fishing, running fisheries with local government. How do you integrate that with, with herding on grasslands, right? It looks really different. And is there an integration model? Is there an integration model that works with then farmers, managing water rights, right? Is there a way of scaling up solutions so that everyone can kind of use the same solution in a way that's like general? And that's where the Black Lives Matter thing is so interesting. It's like, New York City has very little in common with Ferguson, Missouri, right? And culturally and socially and socioeconomically, they're very different places. Um, and the fact that Eric Gardner was killed in New York City and it was videotaped and it was put online, you think, well, okay, that's going to be the epicenter for some big movement. And it's important historically that it wasn't, right? That there's no reason why a video of a man being choked by a police officer that's put online got 48 tweets. Like, what happened, right? And then all of a sudden, Ferguson, Missouri, which is nowhere. I mean, I've been to Missouri. Ferguson, Missouri is nowhere. And Ferguson, Missouri is the epicenter for this nationwide movement that gets the attention of the White House, right? And it's like what had shifted was the pattern of connections between these different groups, and it shifted over the course of Ferguson. And what shifted between Ferguson and George Floyd was 6 years of those networks growing nationally and internationally. So by the time of the George Floyd event, there was like this massive infrastructure that could just take that and turn it into something really substantial, which was like nationwide and worldwide protesting, which is something that no one expected from, a bouncer in Minneapolis, right? And so it's like it's a really big shift in public awareness, but it's also a really big shift in the infrastructure to support that. And I do think that, one of the big things about that change that it's often overlooked is that in July 2014, when Eric Gardner was killed, there was a poll taken of the US, and um, a very small fraction of people thought that Black Lives Matter was real. The vast majority of American citizens, Republican and Democrat, thought that it was basically people complaining about their situation, but that there wasn't a problem with police violence in Black neighborhoods. It was basically like criminals complaining. And 6 years later, by 2020, almost 80%, 78% of Americans, Republican and Democrat, said they thought that police violence in Black neighborhoods was a problem and that something should be done about it. Now that is just, especially given the history of the US and race, that is just a huge change in people's thinking about whether or not there's a problem of race and police violence in Black neighborhoods in 6 years. And so it's just, you have to just take that in and think about like what could happen in 6 years, right? We the same number of deaths, in fact, more deaths preceding 2014 than between 2014 and 2020, right? So like what happened? And what happened was a shift in the conversations in these networks that allowed them to sort of internalize a common language and a common way of talking, even though their experiences are so different. But by 2020, there were like white suburban moms marching side by side with Black African youth in the city. And like that was not something you would have seen before, right? And so you saw that because people were talking the same language in the same networks, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's just, it seems like a simple thing, but it does so much work, right? Mm-hmm. And so I would say that when we're thinking about scaling, that's what we're thinking about. That is, George Floyd that's scaled, right? And the point is that when we're thinking about that in conservation, and this is something I'm working on, I've been working with the Moore Foundation for the last year on this, is building a scaling network that goes across like fisheries and grasslands and farmers, and trying to develop an infrastructure, largely networks that allow for communication and allow for learning to grow at scale. Because I think that is actually the huge thing. And a huge part of that is the concept of wide bridges and the concept of what I call complex centrality, which is basically saying where is the center of the network. And most interesting thing is that video I showed you of the center of the network not spreading very effectively and this little part over here in the corner taking over, right? It's because that part in the corner, we can identify it mathematically. Where when we shift from simple contagion to complex contagion, that actually becomes the center of the network. Mm-hmm. And now we still draw it using the same graph visualization layout, so it looks like it's on the outside. But if you take the perspective of wide bridges, that's actually the location where the most wide bridges interact, and that's the place you're going to get the most growth from. Mm-hmm. And so that tells us that when we're thinking about how to create infrastructure and exploit infrastructure for scaling, we can actually target growth in a new kind of way. I had a talk that started at 9:30, or 9:15 rather. So I have to jump. But this has been very, very fun. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. You go to your next talk. We're going to have a lot to digest over the next 2 days. Thank you so much for joining us with Absolutely. All this great information.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
Take care, Damon. Phew. Lots to digest there. But fear not. Our kind of our steps through the next 2 days over the next 3 sessions is to hear a lot from researchers, digest it together into like tangible terms, into like actionable terms, and kind of wrap up at the end with some of our own best management practices. Up next, we have Julia Baird, and she's going to actually answer a lot of the questions that I saw in the chat about like proving proving that an idea went from one place to another place, and kind of the methodology behind mapping our social networks. Yeah, so take it away, Julia.
Okay, thanks, Tori. And that's a lot of pressure. I'll do my best to answer some of those questions at least. Let me share.
You'll do great.
Go into slide share mode. There we go. Does that look okay? I get the thumbs up. That's
Looks
great. Okay, thanks so much, Tori. I appreciate it. Yeah, just a pleasure, and like, wow, what an introduction to thinking in a kind of network way about change. And so I'm going to take it down to the level of one network, one fairly small network. I mean, when you look at some of Damon's network maps, that there's so many, there's a lot there, and I'm going to look at something smaller scale. So the focus here is on some work that I've done together with two collaborators, Jose Daniel Teodoro, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Delft in the Netherlands, and Doran Otung, who was a master's student with me a couple of years ago. And looking at the Ontario Soil Network as a community of practice and taking a network perspective to the network, I guess. Here we go. All right, so first, maybe just to clarify what a community of practice is, or how I think about a community of practice. I really like this description from a researcher from about 20 years ago now. Wow, the 2000s are 20 years ago, and that's just shocking. But they say it's a group of people who share a concern, a set of problems, or a passion for a topic, and who deepen their knowledge and expertise by interacting in an ongoing basis. And I think, that's a really nice description of what happens in the Ontario Soil Network, and specifically around the leadership challenge, which is where we focused our work. So we think this term applies really nicely to the OSN. And why are communities of practice interesting or important or useful? I guess there's two parts to this that I want to speak to. One is that they tend to foster learning. When you interact with others, you learn from them, and there's different ways of thinking about learning. I know we say learning, and maybe what comes to mind is you learn a new fact, or somebody tells you something you didn't know before, and that's part of it, but there's different types of learning beyond that. So if we look at kind of the three bubbles that come out of learning here, the first one is that learning something new, and we call that cognitive learning. Then there's other types of learning, and this is something that Damon referenced. There's normative learning, which is changing the way that you think about a topic, or your kind of internal motivations or values around something that is the focus of your community of practice. And then the third type is relational learning, and that's actually building relationships kind of in response to those interactions around the topic of your community of practice. So you see the two blue shaded ones are ones that I'll touch on today in relation to this network-based approach. Learning's great, but we're also interested in how that relates to practice change as well. And so there are relationships between learning and practice change. And we see that within communities of practice. And there's two kinds of practice change that I'm going to connect with today. One is expansion of existing practices. So, you know, applying cover crops to a greater percentage of your fields, for example. And then there's also adoption of new practices. So things you weren't doing before, but now you're trying. And I think that covers that. Yeah, so the focus of this particular work was taking a network-based lens to a community of practice created by the OSN, the Leadership Challenge. And there's three questions that I'll talk to more. One is, how do networks change in a farmer community of practice? So we were just really curious to understand what that network change looked like over the 1 year time horizon of the Leadership Challenge. And I'll show you that. And number two, to what extent do practices and motivations change? And then third, can we find a relationship between network change and practice change? And I think you'll be excited by the results. And there's a paper that was published out of this as well. And at the end, I can pop that into the chat box. It's open access, so anybody can read it. It's an academic article, so forewarned. But if it's of interest to you, by all means, please take a look. All right, so three networks of interest. You know, we can look at networks in a variety of ways. There's all sorts of relationships among people or organizations or animals or whatever that we might be interested in, and networks are just a way to look at that. But in this case, we were interested in communication, and the question we asked was, how often do you communicate with this person? So a very kind of simple relationship of, do you communicate with them or not, and then how often? And then the advice network. So we asked specifically about, you know, what is the nature of your communication with this person? And we gave some options. Respondents to our questionnaires could indicate that they received advice or gave advice or both. And then the third network of interest was practice change. And the question there was, since joining the OSN, have you made a production system change as a result of your communication with this person? So trying to make that direct connection between those relationships, those interactions, and on the ground changes. Yeah, so before we really get into those, I thought it would be useful to just give you a very brief overview of some network things, some concepts, and how we actually do network analysis to help understand the results that I'll show you in a minute. So here we go. So first of all, what's a network analysis? I know Damon showed a lot of network diagrams or network maps. They tend to look like, you know, clouds of dots and lines. But what that is just a way of looking at connections between things. And the building blocks of a network analysis are nodes, which are the circles. And the nodes can be a lot of different things, as I said. In this case, the nodes are participants in the Leadership Challenge. And then the other building block is ties, so the connections among those nodes. And I identified three networks that we were interested in. So three types of ties: communication, advice change, and practice change. And usually these ties are visualized as either lines or arrows. And if you look at the little diagram on the right side of the screen, you'll see the little ABC. So the three nodes, A, B, and C, would be people in a network. And the arrows tell us how they're connected. So you can see A reported a connection to B. So we can see that, you know, the arrow originates at A, points at B. We can also see that B did not reciprocate that connection. So B did not report a connection to A because we don't see the arrow also going in the other direction. Whereas A and C mutually reported connection. So if we say this is something like a friendship tie, A is friends with B and C, but B doesn't really recognize that friendship. And this creates all sorts of opportunities to look at these interactions among people in different ways. So, carry on here. Okay, so 2 network measures that I'll talk about quite a lot today that I think are just worth kind of explaining a little bit in advance. One is density. So density refers to the number of ties between nodes in a network in relation to the total possible ties that could exist. So if every node was connected to every other node in the network, density would be 1. And anything less than 1 indicates that not all the ties exist that could exist. So you can see 2 different diagrams on the screen here. The one on the left has a very high density. You can see how connected all of the nodes are to each other. Whereas the diagram on the right, you can see that there's much kind of less density there. So, and we see the resulting values below there. So density on the left is 0.78, density on the right, 0.13. So only 13% of the total connections that could exist do exist in that network. Density allows us to understand just how tightly connected a network is, and allows us to look at things like change over time in connections. The other network measure that's important to explain a little bit here is centralization, and that is how evenly distributed those connections are among nodes within the network. So this connects to this idea of potentially like this influencer idea that Damon introduced. I'm going to approach it a little bit differently, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But essentially, it looks at, you know, the extent to which there's one or a few nodes in the network that are much more highly connected than every other node. So you can see again, the diagram on the left has high centralization because that central node, that red node, is very highly connected to the rest of the network, and the blue nodes are kind of on the periphery and tend to be less connected. So that means that, you know, that differential between that red node and how many connections it has and those other nodes around the edges means that there's high centralization. So there's just a very uneven distribution of nodes across all, or of ties across all nodes. Whereas the diagram on the right, even though there's lots and lots of ties, they're very evenly distributed among all of the nodes. So it actually has a low centralization. It means that every node has relatively the same number of connections to others in the network. So that's centralization. All right, so now we get to some results. The first question was, how did the networks change? And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. So I hope that it might look a little overwhelming at first, but I'll walk you through this. Okay, so maybe just to explain how we collected the data, first of all, we asked those involved in the leadership challenge a few years ago to complete a questionnaire shortly after they started, but we asked them to think back to before they started and tell us about their connections to others in the leadership challenge before they started it. So we're really trying to capture that kind of pre-OSN network. What did it look like? Then we asked them essentially the same questions at the end of that 1-year challenge. And so you can see for each of these 3 networks that are listed along the left, there is a pre-OSN network, there is a post-OSN network, and then there's also this third very colorful network called change over time. I will get to that in just a second. But important to say that when we asked about these pre and post networks, we gave those who participated in the study, a list of others in the leadership challenge, and they were only asked to tell us about those people and those connections. So we didn't ask about all their connections that exist in the world, just those that exist within that leadership challenge network. Okay, so what you'll hopefully probably see is that over time, from pre to post, there is an increase in the number of connections for all three networks. So we see them become more dense over time, and we'll look at each of them separately in a little bit more detail in a second. But that's good. One of the exciting and perhaps not totally surprising takeaways is that we saw networks build more connections over time, grow. The change over time network is a really fun, it's something that I've never done before, but I think it's really useful. And we looked at the nature of the change over time. So the colors have meanings, obviously, and I'll give you the key here. So the blue ties are new ones. So those are things that, ties that didn't exist pre-OSN, but did exist post. The red ones are dropped ties. So we saw some ties that were reported before the leadership challenge disappear afterwards. Orange means that there was a decreased frequency of interaction from pre to post. Green means there was increased frequency. So the tie existed, but it became stronger over time. And then yellow are the ones that had no change. So we see a lot of change, you know, even though, you know, the pre and post network maps show us that overall ties increased over time, doesn't tell us about, you know, the nuances of that change, but this third network really allows us to do that. So we see a lot of blue ties, which is great, but we see some red, we see some orange. Hopefully you can see the colors on this slide. And I know that this is being recorded, so if you want to return to this later and spend a bit more time with it, I would welcome you to do that, because I know it's a lot to take in. But I am going to move on and look at each of these networks and give you a little bit more information about them. Oh, there, I had a little circle around it. There we go. Okay, so the first network that we'll look at is just communication change over time. And we see the density increase, and we can look at the value of that density increase. So it went from 16% of all ties present before the leadership challenge started, and then increased to 26%. So we see quite a big change in density. And I think it's also worth flagging that the people who participated in this study and in the leadership challenge, and there were 19 of them that we were able to capture pre and post out of about 31 that participated. So we don't have the whole network represented here, but a good proportion of it. There were connections before the leadership challenge started. It's not like these were, you know, farmers who had never interacted before. Some of them hadn't. You see some nodes that have no connections, but certainly, you know, there's some evidence that there was already some beginnings of a network that existed before the leadership challenge. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about centralization here. So we see that centralization is quite high in the pre-OSN network, and it increases over time. So what this tells us is that some farmers tended to be to communicate more with others in the network, that those ties were unevenly distributed before the leadership challenge, and we see that unevenness increase over time. So a subset of farmers became even more kind of embedded and connected to the network in terms of communication, tended to report communicating with a lot of others, and others not so much. So the communication patterns were quite uneven. All right. Second, we're going to look at advice change over time. And so if you'll recall, this is, you know, the nature of the communication that that individuals reported to others. So again, we see that there was some advice exchange happening before the leadership challenge. And again, it increased over time. So the density went from 11% of all possible connections to 16%. And then we see centralization increase very slightly, but it's much lower than the communication network. So if you recall, the centralization measure for the communication network was like 0.6 to 0.8. Here it's 0.23, so it's much lower if we think about it on a scale from 0 to 1. So we do see a slight increase in that centralization. So some farmers potentially became a little more popular in terms of, you know, giving advice or receiving advice than in the pre-OSN network. But advice doesn't necessarily equate to behavior change, right? And that's something that I think came out of Damon's presentation as well. And so I think we think it's useful to look at practice change over time. And these are the ties that indicate that somebody directly influenced another person's change, use of BMPs from pre to post. So we see, not surprisingly, that the density for this network is lower because it's a very specific question that we're asking about, like direct influence on you making a decision about your farming operation. So the density increased from 0.07 to 11, so from 7% to 11% of all possible nodes, or ties, I'm sorry. And so that's, I think, you know, we were excited to see that, you know, there's more interactions that are resulting in practice change over time. Not that they didn't exist at all before the leadership challenge started, but that there was an increase. So there was some effect of the leadership challenge and that community of practice operating over the course of a year. And then there's the centralization scores. And here we're gonna get into it a bit more. And this connects again to something that Damon was saying, and I'm not going to use influencers in a derogatory way or in a way that indicates that you know, they're kind of in that star shape. But influencers are people who tend to have an influence on more people's decisions to implement a practice change. So it's not that there's, you know, one central person, but we're just looking at who influences whom here. Another term for this is in-degree centralization, which is a very technical networky term, and I'm just going to use influencers because I think it's better understood. So what do we see? Interestingly, we see the centralization in relation to those who were influencing others decrease over time. So what that means, if you recall from centralization, that ties become more evenly distributed over time. So we have more influencers, potentially, well, we do, but they kind of have even influence. So we're seeing a much more distributed network of influence, and that's exciting, I think. We can look at those influenced as well. So if we think about influencers as the people who are sending an influence tie to somebody else and that person's making a behavior change, the reverse is we look at those who were influenced and look at centralization from that perspective. So if I decide to make a behavior change or a practice change, I decide that I'm going to, you know, use new erosion control measures. And that I report that happened because I had a conversation with Tori. She convinced me, you know, I saw what she was doing and I think it's great and I'm going to try it. If she's the only one who influenced me, then I would have a very low kind of being influenced score. But if I report that, you know, I talked to Tori, but I also talked to 5 other people who, you know, also had an influence over my decision. So there's, you know, 6 people that I can say directly influenced my decision to make this practice change, then that centrality becomes higher for me. So I would become probably one of the, you know, central nodes in the those influenced or out degree network. So when we look at that, who was influenced and by how many others, we see the centralization increases just a little bit over time, but the increase is so small that I don't think it's really worth flagging as an important result. So essentially it stayed relatively even. So we see, you know, people being influenced and the centralization is not very high. And we see that, you know, who's becoming the influencer and how much they're influencing much more evenly distributed over time. Okay, so the second question was, to what extent did practices and motivations change? So we'll first talk about practices. So here's what we found when we asked the question kind of post leadership challenge. And this is presented in terms of the percentage of farmers. And as I said, there were 19 people who responded. They could tell us about all of these things. So, you know, there's, you know, one farmer may have implemented all of these things. But we see that the expansion or the implementation of new BMPs after the 1-year leadership challenge, far and away cover crops tended to be the most implemented BMP, and then crop rotation and manure and composting next, and then we see, you know, a drop off from there. These were specific BMPs that we were interested in, so we gave them the options. We didn't just ask, you know, what BMPs are you implementing now that you weren't before, but we gave them some discrete options. I will say that mostly these were expansion of existing BMPs and not new ones. In fact, I think I just did the math before this talk this morning, and 37 expanded BMPs I counted and 5 new BMPs. So far and away, you know, it was just using these things more often. All right, and now motivations, and I want to connect to something that Damon said here, because he mentioned that, you know, people don't know why they do things, and that could be true. I don't doubt that he's got a point there, but it is useful to understand how people perceive their own motivations, and that I use that a lot in my work, is this kind of perception of why you do things, or what the barriers might be to implementing a change. And so even if they don't represent true motivations or kind of your deepest, darkest reasons for doing something, it tells us something interesting to see how these, you know, what people selected changes over time as a result of participating in that network, which is the common factor that everyone shared. So what we see is some really cool results from this. We asked people to identify the primary motivation for each of the BMPs that they had implemented or expanded in kind of the post questionnaire. And we see that motivations increase. The primary motivation, I thought it was the right thing to do, increased from 18% to 36% of all responses. And then we see some things decrease. So it saved me money. So the focus on economics tended to decrease from 9% to 4%. So it wasn't a big motivating factor in the beginning for most of the respondents, but it decreased over time. And we also saw a decrease in selecting "it was better for my farm" from 55% to 42%. So still, you know, an important motivation, but became a little less important to some over time. And what I think is really interesting and exciting about this is that we see an increase in kind of more societal benefits, thinking beyond, you know, your own farm to the broader kind of region, community, ecosystem around you, society, and a little less focus on the internal or farm level benefits, potentially. All right, and then the third question is a relationship between changes in networks and changing practices. Yeah, the short answer is yes, but I'll give you a bit more of a nuanced answer to that. Okay, so, oh geez, oops, trying to move my little screen here so I can actually see what it says. Okay, so first we'll look at the communication network. So what we did was we tried to look at how the communication and advice network related to the practice change network. So were they correlated? Did we see this, you know, the same connections occur between those networks? There's some fancy statistics that you can do to compare networks and look at the correlation, so the degree to which they're similar, and it can tell us whether or not they're so similar that it couldn't happen by chance. And that's essentially what we're looking at here. So what we found was that pre-OSN, there was no association between the communication network and the practice change network. So those two things were so different that they weren't really related to each other. But post OSN, which is super cool, there is an association between the communication ties and the practice change ties. So we see those networks kind of converge or become more similar. So we see this as network participants were likely influencing each other in relation to practice change, and we can relate that to that communication network through stats. Then we looked at the advice network, and what we found there, what we found there was that the advice network was correlated with the practice change work network, both before and after the leadership challenge. So if a farmer received advice from another network member, they also tended to make a practice change attributed to that member. So the advice network was a relatively good mirror of making a practice change. We know that that's not always the case. Like, you think about the advice that you get in your daily life, you don't always take it up, right? Like, some people love to give you advice, but it may not be useful. I can think of certain members of my family that I might flag as advice givers, but they don't necessarily result in a change to my personal way of living life. And so it was really important to us to look at that relationship between the advice network and the practice change network. And I will just flag that we saw these correlations, but we see that, you know, specific advisors may have changed over the course of the OSN, even though we saw that, you know, that correlation existed both pre and post. All right, so I guess where I'll end is with a few key points that I'd love for you to take away from this. This is really like a descriptive effort here, right? To understand what happened within this leadership challenge community of practice over time, and a way to kind of understand how that relates to changes within the network individuals and also their kind of external practices. So we see that networks grew. All three networks grew. So we saw some relational learning. So if we think about relational learning being building relationships with others within a community of practice, we saw that happen. Network measures were associated with practice change. So we saw that communication at the end of the program and advice at both time points were associated with practice changes. So there's something happening in the network that supports some behavioral change. motivations changed, or at least reported motivations changed with a reduced focus on individual level benefits, though they still were certainly important, and a greater focus on societal or moral benefits. So having an impact because it's the right thing. And this is a signal of some normative learning. So some changes in kind of how you think about the practices that you engage in. And ultimately, there's evidence here that the OSN is affecting some changes, both internal and external, which is really exciting. And I'm so pleased to be able to do this work. So I just want to thank the Ontario Soil Network for their in-kind support, and the Canada Research Chairs Program, which provided some financial support, especially for, well, me and my collaborators on this. So thanks, and I look forward to your questions. I'll stop sharing now.
Amazing. Thank you, Julia. Some questions in the chat. I think one important one to get to kind of immediately is about those network, those network maps, those diagrams. There was some varying distance between dots. And so one of the questions was like, are there XYZ axes? Like what's behind the difference in distance?
Yeah, good question. And sorry I didn't explain that earlier. I should have. So we use a program called, well, there's different programs that will take network data and make a map for you. And generally what they do is, unless you tell it otherwise, is to put the nodes that are have the most similar connections closer together, and nodes that tend to be more connected more towards the center. So it uses an algorithm to make these decisions. We use that algorithm for the communication change, or the communication networks. And then we kept those nodes in the very same place for looking at all the networks, so that we could see which nodes were connected in various ways. So if you look at those, I won't pull it back up, but if you go back and you look at the where they're situated in space for all three networks, the nodes stay in the same place. So you can kind of see, you know, who had a connection, who lost a connection, and it just allows us a better sense of understanding the network. But yeah, that's why you see some bigger distances between different nodes, and yeah, it's a very kind of complicated algorithm that it uses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you know, the methodology used in this project, like we were very scoped to just the soil network. We weren't, I mean, we care about PhD students, and so we gave them a scope instead of, you know, an 8-year PhD. But surely the methodology changes depending on the scale of network that you're looking at. And I think Damon uses a lot of like social listening platforms that capture a lot of data from social media platforms like Twitter to kind of to map and characterize the connections that we have virtually. Do you want to speak a little bit about how methodology changes depending on the scope of an analysis?
Yeah, happy to. And yes, absolutely. So what I tend to do as a researcher is look at smaller networks, and I don't focus on kind of like social media platforms or things like that. So there's a very different methodology to that I honestly, I'm not the expert, so I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly what that looks like in practice, but I tend to bound them quite tightly. So, you know, in this case, we looked at a specific network of people who were engaged in the same community of practice over a period of time. And by doing that, we can really get a sense of what, you know, how well we capture the network by how many respondents we get in relation to how many people exist within that network. We can put a really nice clear boundary around it. And usually with network analysis, you want about 80% of those involved in the network to respond in order to get a really good sense of what's actually happening. You know, if you get down to like 10 or 20% of people in a network giving you data, it's not a very reliable understanding of what's happening in that network. So by working with small networks, we can, I guess, one, be clear on who's in the network and who's not. And we can ask about every single other person in that network specifically. So another way of doing it is just to ask, like if I didn't have a boundary around a network, but I was interested in understanding a network like, I don't know what a good example is, but maybe you wanted to send something out across Ontario to farmers and understand, you know, who else they were connected with, you know, in relation to a particular issue. Soil health might be a good one. Then you could, you know, you can't give them a roster of every single other farmer in Ontario. It's just not realistic. So the method changes. You ask them probably for a recall, like, hey, tell us the top 10 people or top 5 people that you talk to about soil health. And then you try to, you know, formulate a network out of the responses that you get. And that gets more challenging in a variety of ways for analyzing networks, although it is, you know, it's another way of doing it and not, you know, it's useful certainly. But the way that we do this is I think kind of my preferred scale to work with.
Certainly. Yeah. Yeah. And something, you know, that we always see at this like Ontario-wide surveying scale is like when you have your scope as Ontario and there's not necessarily like a project-based scope or like an applied scope, it's a self-selection scope. You know, people are self-selecting to respond to the surveys, and it's usually not non-adopters. And so your surveys are skewed by something that is out of your control. I want to start tying your findings in with some of the themes that we learned about with Damon. Scott's specific question is change beginning at the periphery. Did you see any difference in contributions to change between the more central versus the more peripheral actors? And on the flip side to that coin, also susceptibility to change. So can you kind of tie what we saw in the soil network analysis to those like redundancies and like peripheral versus firework actors?
Yeah, so maybe I said I wasn't going to share my screen again, but I think I'm going to share my screen again and just pull that back up because I think it will be useful as a talking point here. So just bear with me. All right, we're going to go back.
Rewind.
Here we go. We'll stop here. Okay. So if we look at, I'll point you to the practice change network. If you look at the second diagram there, the post-OSN diagram, what you see is that there are some nodes that are more central than others. And of course, you know, we would expect that it's not perfectly evenly, you know, the ties aren't perfectly evenly distributed. So any arrow that originates at a node and points towards another node means that that node where the arrow originates is influencing the node that has the arrow pointing at it. So you can kind of see with your own eyes what's happening here. We see that there are several individuals that are influencing other people. I don't have the exact numbers on, you know, who and exactly where they are. That would be really interesting to look at. This was, you know, our first effort to analyze the data. And I think there's much, much more we can do with the network data that we have. But you do see that, there are, there's one node in there in particular in the middle that seems to be quite influential, but there are lots of other nodes, not all of them in the center, that are having an influence. So if I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but hopefully, if not, kind of on the left side of that diagram, there's a node that is pointing to another node that's on the periphery. We see one here kind of on the top right that is pointing towards another peripheral node that's having an influence. We see the one on the far right that's quite connected, that's influenced and also influencing others. So I wouldn't say that, I don't see anybody in this network that fits the description as Damon would have described it, as an influencer, like I guess in the way that he would describe it. This is more of a distributed network. So, lots of communication, lots of influence happening from a variety of individuals. It's harder to see kind of that, the cloud-based grouping that he had of the different networks, because it's such a small one. And we don't see those little kind of like subgroups forming with those, bridges to other subgroups in the same way that he described, just because of the nature of, or the scale, I guess, of the work. So, what we might see if we looked further is, OSN as one of those clouds potentially, and certain actors or certain individuals within that network becoming more influencer or kind of early influencers within that small cloud that then exert their influence elsewhere. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I want to just kind of like note that in 2019, we did this study, and it was the last year that we ran the leadership challenge, as it were, because then I read Damon's book. I was like, oh, like this kind of paired with a lot of farmers in the network being like getting the ick at the idea of being leaders, was like, that is not the objective of this project. And so we changed it to the network challenge. We changed a lot of the skills that we train in to make sure that people are not trying to be influencers, like in some of the derogatory ways that we have begun to understand the role today, but rather community builders. And then furthermore, as like the results of this study started to come together, we were faced with kind of like, some key findings of like, a diversity within the network being really important to validating the practices that we were trying to influence, but then like, redundancy and relevance kind of also being necessary to improving those like perceived efficacy, like I'm going to be successful at this kind of sentiments. And since then, we've been kind of in this balancing state between building that diversity while simultaneously building that relevance and just kind of feeling our way into how we might balance that, and certainly looking forward to like continuing our work with you in order to make sure that we're doing the thing that we think that we're hoping to do. I think okay, I'm just like trying to catch up on the questions from the chat. Yeah, I guess maybe one of the things that stood out the most to me in our results, I guess two of the things, was that there was an increase in adoption at all. Because at least certainly at that point, not thinking about diversity, we were picking people like, you know, hardened soil health veterans. And so it was miraculous to think that there was any expansion, any opportunity for expansion of BMP adoption. And then the other kind of qualitative observation that we saw that blew me away was just the change in like motivation, going from like, this is good for my farm to this is the right thing to do. Yeah, I wonder if maybe we could talk a little bit more about some of the social norm aspects that you explore in your work on social networks, and like, what does the right thing to do indicate to you? Like, what does that mean to you? How do you ask these kind of like secret trap questions to gain an appreciation for what someone's social norms are, and like how close they're holding culpability and responsibility and for the greater good and for their social network?
Yeah, okay, so good questions. And I will just say, first of all, that I was also really surprised to see practice change, or like adoption and expansion of BMPs. That wasn't, I had the same feeling as you, that these are people who are, you know, you're the converted, and what else are you going to do? That's not really why you're in the network. But it's a really wonderful, I guess, side effect of participating in that program. And I mean, if it can happen among those who are already, you know, really kind of have invested in these practices and are on top of soil health BMPs, then we think that there's a lot of room for this to happen in other communities of practice where maybe there is a more explicit goal of increasing adoption. So to me, that was a really encouraging and exciting result. The social norms bit, that's really tricky. And I mean, I think Damon highlighted some of those challenges of understanding the true motivations, or the true reasons why people make changes in their lives, especially when they may not even recognize it in themselves. Just for everyone's information, when we ask these questions on this survey, we gave explicit options, and the survey was developed together with staff from the OSN. So the reason that we asked the question actually was because there was an interest in this, and some specific reasons that were of interest. So respondents didn't have to choose one of the options we gave them. They could say something else. But most of them did choose one of the options we gave them. So that's also, a limitation of the study for sure, is that it's easy to just pick one of a list of, 5 or 6 and say that that's your primary motivation without too much thought. I think a nice way to get at some of this in a more kind of nuanced way is to use qualitative data. So actually talk to people and start to hear their own voice when they talk about change, because we can start to pick out things that might signify a particular mindset or attitude or motivation that maybe isn't even something that's conscious for them. So I would say that would be one avenue, in the future that we might want to look at, is doing more, still collecting network data and using our quantitative approaches that allow us to do some neat kind of mapping and stats, but also to complement that with some deeper kind of questions and conversations. A lot of the work that I'm doing now is much more focused on people's kind of in what we're calling inner worlds, but essentially, the factors that influence who we are and how we portray ourselves to the world. So a big focus of mine is actually empathy, and thinking about how empathy influences how we think about the world and the sorts of behaviors that we engage in. But there's lots of other factors from psychology that come into play there too. Self-efficacy, openness, agreeableness, all sorts of factors. Some of them are quite malleable and some of them are quite sticky in that they're really hard to change, especially personality factors. But I think there's lots of opportunity here to take a, much more of kind of a internal approach and a qualitative approach to understanding why people make the decisions they do and how they think about agriculture and soil health. And I hope that we have the opportunity to do that. That would be really exciting, I think.
Yeah. I'm chasing after any and all opportunities to continue working with you and I dropped my fidget thing and to feed your team lots of data points to really, not only understand the effects of our own actions at the soil network, but to kind of also understand the environment that we're working